It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Leah Abramowitz. We're here in your beautiful home in Nairobi, in the old city of Jerusalem. And Leah, you originally come from Germany.
That's right.
So if you could tell a little about your family history.
So, I was born into a very comfortable German Jewish family who didn't believe that anything terrible was going to happen to them, in a place called Bad Mergentheim, which is a smallish kind of town near Würzburg. That's more well known. What they had there were baths like you have in Bavaria, and the Kaiser used to come to Bad Mergentheim in order to get some health baths. My father was a viehhandler, what they call a cattle dealer, actually mostly with non-Jews, even though he was strictly religious. His name was Max Fröhlich, which became Max Frohlich when we eventually had to move to the United States. He was one of 12 children, and they were very Yekkish. They had a son, a daughter, a son, a daughter, a son, a daughter, all the way down the line. Most of his brothers and sisters in the middle 30s left for Palestine. My father, who was a businessman and had good relations with all his non-Jewish neighbors, he never believed that anything bad would happen. He thought that Hitler was something passing phase. And so he stayed and stayed and stayed also. He had an old mother. I can show the picture of his parents. His father, who founded the cattle business, died at the age of 59 when he had a stroke, which today we could have helped him with quickly. His mother was a real patriarch, raising 12 children. And she was also very comfortable. She had 2-3 maids and so on. And she stayed on together with the youngest sister until it was impossible. My father was almost interned, and so he finally saw the light and decided to leave everything. Just overnight, they just closed the door and with a few suitcases went out of the house and were going to meet some man who was going to take them across the border. I'm talking about November 1939, when the war broke out already in Poland. And the man never turned up, so we went back home. Eventually we did leave. I was only 4 years old, so I don't remember very much, only what they told me. We went to Holland, which at that time was not at war, because my father had a sister there. And we stayed there until we booked on a boat to the United States, where my mother had 3 siblings in St. Louis, Missouri. And from being a very comfortable, I would say even wealthy German family with everything that you could think of, my parents took a dive in St. Louis. My father became a factory worker, and to raise extra money, they used to sell chickens and eggs to the Jewish population of St. Louis, where we settled. I grew up as an American kid. I don't remember too much about Germany. We did speak German in the house, and I must say that helped me all my life, the German, having another language. My brother...
You have a picture of your parents?
This is my dad. He eventually came to Israel after being in St. Louis and opening a business there. He managed to build up a very nice little business. And this is my mom in their latter years. Unfortunately, she eventually became demented and also had a stroke, several strokes apparently. And my father, who was once a big businessman and had no interest in the house, became her chief caregiver, but that's much later in Israel already.
And Leah, can I ask, what happened to your parents' family, to the extended family, and to...
I would say out of the 12 children, the youngest daughter, who had stayed with her mother and who wasn't married at the time, eventually went to Israel and Palestine in those days. My father thought you couldn't make a living in Palestine. He was interested in a more higher economic stage, so that's why he chose America. But it was a big problem to get out of Germany. You needed a sponsor. He had some cousins in California, and he wrote to them and asked if you could sponsor him. The cousin wrote back, "Okay, I'll send you a letter of sponsorship, but don't ask me for anything. I don't want to see you, I don't want to help you, I don't want to..."
This was a cousin?
And this was a cousin of his in California. So he went to St. Louis, where my mother had 2 sisters and a brother. And as I said before, they built themselves up. I still remember they were sitting at the table at night, learning English and getting ready for their citizenship examination, which they eventually got. And my father was a real toughie. At home, he was like a bit of a tyrant, a Prussian. My mother never really adjusted, never really became an American. She was embarrassed with her accent and not knowing her way around. And she must have had a nervous breakdown once the news of what was going on in Germany came through. She learned that her parents had perished, and that her mother-in-law, this great patriarch, also had been put into a concentration camp and died from disease. And during that time, when she was in a hospital, and my sister and I were taken by a social worker, my first contact with social work, to a children's home. And then we also lived with our aunts, an aunt and an aunt-in-law, which had a definite influence on our lives. Once my mother was well again, we went back home. And we grew up as regular Jewish kids, Orthodox, in St. Louis, which did not have a large Orthodox community. But I was connected in some way through the shul, where my parents davened, to a new organization called Young Israel. And they had this idea that to be Orthodox in America is a great zchut, is a great honor. You can really develop yourself as a Jew. And that led eventually to my interest in Yiddishkeit and in Zionism, because most of the kids who grew up in St. Louis did not even stay Jewish, I would say. They married out. It was not like New York, where all your friends were also Jewish and so on. But Young Israel had a great influence on me, and eventually we found Bnei Akiva, and Bnei Akiva, actually, we came to a summer camp in the Midwest, outside of Chicago, and that changed my life. That led eventually to being sent to a course in Jerusalem at the age of 18 to learn in the Machon LeMadrichei Chutz La'aretz. Then we had to go back and work for Bnei Akiva for 2 years. That was the idea. Because St. Louis wasn't such a large Jewish population, they decided to send me to Montreal because I was an educated madrigal. I became what they call today a communarit, and I became part of the Montreal community. I had a position of honor, I would call it, in Montreal. I finished my studies in social, well, it wasn't social work, it was in sociology and psychology, and I worked for a living. I also did secretarial work. I did quite a lot in those days, which I continue to do all my life. The day that I finished my responsibilities to Bnei Akiva, I got on a boat and I came to Israel. In those days you didn't fly. And I settled in Jerusalem. Is this the...
Yeah. Can I just ask, going just a little bit back, did your family ever buy German goods, or was that prohibited?
I don't remember any anger toward the Germans, any when you don't buy from a place, it's
boycotting.
No boycotts. And they spoke German all the time in the home.
And did they have friends, any German friends?
Yes, all their friends. In fact, they had very few friends, but all their friends were Germans.
These were
German
Jews.
refugees.
Yeah.
In fact, there was a little organization in St. Louis of German refugees. Some of them still retained their German identity. My parents were already in their 40s when they came to St. Louis, and it couldn't have been easy for them. In fact, one of the things that my father did when he came to St. Louis, he worked in a packing house in St. Louis, in East St. Louis. And that was a job that he got because of his background with the cattle business. There he was associated with Orthodox Jews. Most of his other contacts were not even Jewish. But he had to walk from our house, because he wouldn't drive, of course, on Shabbat, to water the kosher meat that they were selling, that they were, and he would walk I can't remember how many miles to get to the to this place, and he would stay over. And going into the cooler and out of the cooler must have had a effect on him, and he was very, very sick. And he was quite new in the country. They put him in an isolation ward. And my mother, who didn't know the language, had 3 children at home, would be able to talk to him from the street underneath the isolation ward. He was on the 4th floor. He had very little strength to get to the window to talk to her. And she was, like one of the problems that new immigrants have in this country and every country is not knowing your way around, not knowing, what you have to do. After that, she had a nervous breakdown. That was the reason that we were sent out of the house. So it wasn't an easy klita at all, an easy getting involved. But my father was a very tough guy, as I said at the very beginning. To make ends meet, he started selling chickens and eggs. Me and my brother, we used to deliver the eggs. I still remember once it was raining outside and I slipped on the pavement, and all the eggs in the basket broke. I was right outside the house of the lady who was supposed to buy the eggs. I broke into tears, and she comforted me and she paid me, even though all the eggs were on the floor. But we were part of that klita, part of that integration. But otherwise, I felt like just an ordinary American girl.
And Leah, can I ask, did your parents speak a lot about growing up in Germany or their home in Germany? I
think I absorbed it. I don't think that they spoke that much, but I mean, even the lullabies that my mother would sing were German lullabies. And it's important to know that a place like Bad Mergentheim wasn't like a place like Frankfurt. It was, a very small community, Kokoshi, I guess, a million, but a very nice shul. And the Jews had a very honorable position there. I don't think they felt anti-Semitism before Hitler. And even my father, who was the highest taxpayer in Bad Mergentheim, had a very nice relationship with the head of the police in Bad Mergentheim. In fact, they had been in the same army unit in World War I. And when there was on Kristallnacht, I think right after Kristallnacht, all over Germany they interned Jews who, for quite a while in some concentration camps, but then mostly they released them. My father was sick with the flu that day, and here comes in this German head of the police, and he says, "We have to take you, Herr Fröhlich." And he says, "I'm sick, I've got a flu." He said, "Okay, I know you, stay in bed." And that's how he never went to a concentration camp.
Did they destroy the shul in Kristallnacht?
They started to burn it, and then the neighbors next door, all the houses were connected, yelled bloody murder, my house is going to go up in flames, so they put it out. So there they saved the Sifrei Torah, and they did not really destroy the...
And does it still exist today?
I don't know. I did go to Bad Mergentheim on my way to Israel the first time, but I don't remember what happened to the shul. I mean, the whole Bad Mergentheim has been rebuilt. It's not the same Bad Mergentheim. But they are definitely what we call survivors of the Holocaust. I mean, the business that my grandfather had built up and that my father, as the oldest of the 12, took over, they had to sell it for peanuts before they left. And their whole belief in the German culture, my father, as I said, had been in the army, and he never believed that, having been citizens like everybody else, that there would be persecution of the Jews. That was a tremendous shock. And as I mentioned before, he didn't believe anything bad would happen, and he stayed on to the very, very end.
So that you lived in November. So the war had already started in September.
Yeah.
And what was the turning point that made them decide to leave?
I think that when that police officer came to arrest him and take him to a concentration camp, I think he finally had a zitz. He was very loath to leave his mother, but his mother refused to go either to Palestine or to Israel, or to America with him. And unfortunately, she, like so many elderly people in that generation, was taken to one of the concentration camps, which was sort of a picture, with sort of a where they used to show people, were taking good care of. I can't remember the name at this minute. She died there, just like my mother's parents as well.
Could have been Theresienstadt?
Theresienstadt, exactly. Theresienstadt.
See, they did try to show that it was a model.
Exactly. And as a matter of fact, just as you're interested in all the Shoah repercussions and so on, because of my stay in Holland for half a year, I had actually, on our way to America, I actually wore wooden shoes as a child, and I went to a kindergarten in Holland. My whole life I've had an interest in Dutch survivors, and I've had Dutch friends in Israel all my life, and I still hear from that half a year. And I know that many, 3 or 4 books were written about the Dutch community, which also ended up in Theresienstadt, and which had many people were annihilated. Not in Theresienstadt, they were sent east to Auschwitz. But I've covered Theresienstadt for quite a while.
And can I ask, did your
Yes.
parents have not regrets, but did they feel a little bit guilty that they left their...
I hadn't heard that. I didn't hear that. I think my father never had regrets about anything because he was a person very sure of himself, and that's what helped him when after he finished, he got out of the hospital, then he started working in a factory as a, what do you call it, maksana in English, working in a what's the word, a maksan.
Like a factory, yeah.
A clothing factory. And this man who had been involved with cows and horses and things of that sort, all of a sudden he started buying up the seconds, those that had small spots or tears or something, and he sold it to the black people in St. Louis, and he built himself up a business where he sold to the shops. And before he left for Israel to join us, which I'll take it to in a minute, he had built himself up a very nice business out of nothing, but of what things he learned, what shorts or pedal pushers, tops and dresses. He learned a whole new way of doing business, and he succeeded.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And Claire, can I just ask, you married a South African?
Yes.
From Middelburg?
Right.
Is this soon after you came to Israel?
Not really. When I came to Israel, first of all, the first time I came was to study in this course. I went back to America, worked in Montreal, and after 2 years, when I came to Jerusalem, I decided I wanted to live in Jerusalem. I already had a degree in sociology and psychology, not yet in social work. But I applied for work, first in the Ministry of Social Welfare as a secretary, raising money for all good causes, working as the personal secretary for the Minister of Social Welfare, because I knew English, and I taught English to some very prominent people. I have my father's genes. I do a lot of things. And then I worked as a juvenile delinquent officer. I say in a joke, it's good training for my kids. And then I worked at the same time in, what's it called? Vocational training, helping people decide what they want to study or what they want to become. And I worked at the same time in the Blind Institute as a secretary. And then on the side, I started feeling that I'm not putting to effect all my B'nai Akiva training. We have to do something for the young people. And at that time, there was a tremendous influx of new immigrants from non-Western countries, from the North Africa and Asia, and so on. Most of them were placed in moshavim, villages, or development towns. So together with some other young people, we started going out to these places on Shabbat to work with the young people, because we saw that many of them came from traditional homes, but they had the feeling that in Israel, they were aided to have that feeling, incidentally. You don't need that stuff, all that, halakha and all that Yiddishkeit. Here, you're modern, just as you take off your shaliba, you also take off your Shabbos, and you take off your kashrus. And so we came as young Western people who are frum, and tried to show them through programs and through our own just being there, that you can still keep to your tradition. In fact, it's a shame to let it go. So we had some very nice adventures in places like to Oz in the with the Kochini Jews, in Ta'anach in the north, in Gilat. And it was in Gilat that I got engaged to my husband, who was from South Africa. And he was at that time in Israel, first as a soldier for Machal, and when he got out of Machal, he decided to go to a yeshiva, a new yeshiva that was just starting in Keren V'Yavne. So he was in the first Machzor of Keren V'Yavne, and we are the first married couple from Keren V'Yavne.
And your husband volunteered in the 56 Sinai
That's
campaign.
right. He was a soldier in the 56. I have a picture of him as well as a soldier. Shall I bring it? We turn it off for a minute.
So Leah, this is a picture of your husband who volunteered in the Sinai campaign in 1956
yes,
as a soldier from South Africa.
Has quite a lot of interesting stories, but you'll have to interview him for that. So after we got married, having been in this organization, we called it Achva, where we really took to heart our volunteer project to influence youngsters and also the adults, that you can be frum and also you can be modern. We thought that maybe the best thing to do when we started our married life together is to go and live in one of these places rather than to come on Shabbat, with these Zoom visits. So we actually got married in 1959 with chevra, what they call, with friends. Neither of our parents came to the wedding. I ordered the band, which was a blind man from the Blind Institute who played the accordion. I ordered the food, which was gefilte fish from the Mensa, or the students' restaurant. And we picked a place which was cheap on the border in those days, a cafe, Bet Cafe, which was at the edge, the last building on Rehov Yafo. That's where we had our wedding. And the friends from the yeshiva came, my friends came, and of course all the members of that organization, Achva, came, a few aunts and uncles from Petach Tikva, those who had made Aliyah. And as I say, that we decided to go and visit our parents before we start out in life. We had a great year, hitchhiking through Europe, staying in youth hostels, and staying like 3 or 4 months in South Africa, where we made enough money to go to America, and staying 3 or 4 months in America till we made enough money to go to Israel. And on the way we had our first child, Hannah, the only one who was born in America. And so Abby went ahead to look for a place where we could do this volunteer work for a year or two before we settled down properly. And I came subsequently by plane this time, first time by plane with Hannah, and she was a handful, as she still is today. We decided to stay in a place called Netivot, which was a development town down south, which became famous thereafter, not because of us, because of the Baba Sali and the Shivat HaNegev. But we're proud of the fact that we are before either one of those places.
The pioneers.
So Abby became the town treasurer, and I was the first social worker in community work that they had in the South. This was a new field in social work. And we had quite a lot of adventures. Abby relates how the people in Netivot weren't really used to paying taxes. And he once had a man with a long jaliba who came with his 12 children and had a sit-down strike in his office because he wasn't paying those taxes. But it was a good beginning. I started writing about the new immigrants and the ones who came from the Atlas Mountains, not the sophisticated ones who came through France and who only knew Arabic. And it was very, very, very good. And we really became part of the community, and I think because of us, a few other Westerners, shall I call it, young couples, today we would call them a Garin Torani, came as well, joined us, and we stayed not a year or two, we stayed 5 years. Had we stayed on, our children would have gone to the school there, and that we thought wasn't really fair, because the level of the schooling wasn't the same as you would find in cities. So we came to Jerusalem in 1964, and Avi got a job as an accountant with the Chaim Cohen firm, which also specialized in reparation payments to Holocaust survivors. He worked there for 40 years. He didn't move. But I started in many jobs, first as a secretary, and then as a fundraiser. And one day I met a woman on the street who I knew, who was part of a home care team for Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. And she told me that what they do, and that the social worker was going on maternity leave. I said, that sounds like a great idea. I applied. And how did I know that the director of social services at Shaarei Tzedek was new? She didn't ask me how many kids I had. At that time I had 1 daughter and 5 sons. And the last place I had applied for, I was interviewed to be the director of a Merkaz Klita, a new immigrant absorption center in Mevaseret. And the man who interviewed me was a Pamnik, so right away he saw the tickle on my head. And then he asked me how many children I have, and when I told him, he said, "Oh no, madam, I'm not going to let you. Either you'll not do your job properly, or you won't look after your children properly. I wouldn't cause that to happen." So I learned, you don't tell how many children you have. I said, "I have a daughter." Eventually I had a few more daughters, but so I started as a replacement worker in Shaarei Tzedek, and I stayed for 28 years. And I really still feel a part of Shaarei Tzedek. In fact, I'm still on a clinic for evaluating dementia. I still go in once a week for that. As a worker in Shaarei Tzedek, I worked for a while in orthopedics and in children's, and I never worked in children's. I didn't want to work in children's. That was too close to home. In maternity, and when they started the geriatric department, they just founded it, I became part of that team, and that was where I worked most of my years, and I became rather specialized in geriatric social work. As a social worker in that department, I felt the need, because I sat together with a South African new immigrant, Jackie Diamond, who came to learn about social work in Israel. And as we were talking, Jackie and I, about the things I do, and she would sit in on some of my interviews and so on, we came to the conclusion that we really should do something for people with dementia. And Jackie said, "I don't mind working in something like that as a volunteer." So we started a sort of a club for people with dementia, which eventually became Melabev.
Okay, so
And now we'll move to the living room.
1 minute. I just want to thank you so much. Wow. So Leah, this has been such an honor and a privilege to be here and to hear your relating your experiences and your story. And you really are a legend. You really are. And I've read your articles in Jerusalem Report, and the founder of Melabev. It's been such an honor and a privilege, really. And I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Very nice.
You should just have Mazal and Brocha at Maybe Stream, and just nachas from your dear family.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Wilson,
We need one more thing.